Potatoes. We are back after a week to continue talking about the lovely world of potatoes, because it really is a world of potatoes at this
That's
point.
right. Geography is potatoes. Is the
Geography
potato.
is
Yep.
the potato.
Yep.
But before we do that, Hunter, let's go ahead and introduce ourselves and this podcast. I will start us off. So this is the Geography is Everything podcast that you are now listening to. It used to be called the What If Geography podcast. We recently rebranded for a wide variety of reasons that I've now said over a couple of different podcasts. It'll probably be my last podcast where I go into this much detail. But basically, Hunter and I are just trying to get at geography a little more broadly without having to engage inside the what if. There's what if questions, the what if speculation. And so this has been really fun. This is our second part of our first sort of episode series where we're not having to do that. And in a lot of ways, it's very liberating. We sort of just get into the nitty gritty details and not have to deal with all of that. And so, like I said, this is the Geography is Everything podcast. My name is Jeff. You probably have heard, well, you probably know me mostly from my YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/thelasttimegeography by Jeff. And I don't know, I just do geography things here and there. We don't really need to get too deep into it, Hunter.
I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon. I'm also co-author of a couple cultural atlases. The first, Portland is a Cultural Atlas, and the second, Upper Left City, is a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, co-authored with David Banis and with contributions from many excellent geographers, including Jeff Gibson.
Yeah, super fun. So before we dive into our episode, actually, we're going to do a recap here in a minute, but just do some housekeeping things. So first, if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, please review us there. We really appreciate anything you can give us there. It really gives us a real pep in our step every time we get one. So if you are listening on any other podcast app and there's a similar sort of review system, we would appreciate it there as well. I'm not sure which podcast apps do it and don't do it. If you're listening to this on YouTube, great. We're happy that you can finally see us talking. We're really enjoying being on camera to an extent. It's a little bit of a different dynamic. But I think it makes it a little bit more dynamic. If you could, like and subscribe to us on YouTube, that's also awesome. And finally, I already mentioned it once, but you can also listen to this podcast if you're not already on Substack. And if you do that, you get a number of benefits, including sort of an ad-free experience for now, as well as, some bonus content. So if you haven't already subscribed to us on Substack, I strongly encourage you to do so. I think there's a lot of benefits there and a way for you to engage with us a little bit more closely than certainly over sort of, Twitter and Instagram. I do read comments on YouTube. And I do respond to you there. But certainly with podcast apps, it really is more of a one-way street. We don't know how many people subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, for example. So I think Substack's pretty cool. I hope you do too. Hopefully we see you there. With that, Hunter, let's jump into some recap. Let's talk about what we talked about, potatoes, last week.
When we last left the potato, we talked about the origin of the potato, which is in the Andes in South America, around where the country of Peru is now, and how it was domesticated some 8,000 years ago and has become an extremely important staple crop for the people in the Andes Mountains, and how that the potato has a lot of different benefits. And one of the things is it grows at lots of different altitudes. There are over 4,000 different varieties of potatoes that grow, some of which grow well at certain altitudes and some which grow better at other altitudes. And that's part of what's helped people in South America maintain a lot of food security. Because if something happens to one of the crops in one particular area, they have options and crops in other places. And this becomes important to our story in just a little bit later today, talking about what happens when you don't have that, when you don't have a lot of genetic diversity of your food supply. We also talked about the important role of the Spanish, who came in as a colonial power, and took over the territory, most of the territory of South America. Of course, the Portuguese took over what is now Brazil, and there's a few exceptions, of course, in the Caribbean. But because we're talking about the potato, the part of the story that we focused on was the trip that the potato took on a ship back towards Europe, landing on the Canary Islands, and then eventually making its way into Spain and to England and to other countries, and then from there was brought around the rest of the world, and has very quickly become an important staple crop and cultural touchstone for people in different parts of the world. And so if you want to find out all the details of that, go back to last week's episode. But we talked a lot about that and the important role that the potato also played in the rise of industrialization and the rise to a certain degree of urbanization and supporting the giant increases in population that we saw in the 17 and 1800s in Europe.
Right. Yeah. I think the key takeaway here is that historically, while the potato began its, life in, I think we established somewhere in the Andes Mountains in South America, it has grown to become a cultural icon around the world. And for almost for different reasons, right? So we talked a little bit about the Russian vodka. We talked about Idaho a little bit. I think we're going to talk about these places a little bit more in today's episode. But potato has found its way in all kinds of dishes from all kinds of different cultures, right? You can get Indian food with some potato in it. And, potatoes weren't in India until I think we established somewhere around the 1600s. So
1600s.
Yeah. So the potato broadly, sort of last week, we sort of just discussed how this little, tuber, I guess what it's called, this tuber became so synonymous with so many different cultures when very few other things are ever able to hit that sort of benchmark. And we left it last week at a point where I think everybody was kind of expecting us to go, which is Ireland.
That's right. And so I've taught geography for many years now, and I don't give tests anymore because I realize that's not that really helping any people out that much. But I used to give tests, and one of the questions I would sometimes ask in the introductory geography class is, "Where does the potato from?" And every term somebody would write Ireland, and
Ireland.
And the reason is because we hear about the Irish potato famine,
right?
Which was one of the most calamitous events that had happened in Europe. I mean, it's like on the bubonic plague sort of level kind of situation. But to help set the scene, it's important to indicate that the blight that affected the potatoes came from North America. It's thought that the blight started in Mexico, perhaps, then worked its way to the United States, and then worked its way into Europe. And in the 1840s, around 1845, it was in Belgium. So Belgium comes into the story again, where the blight was discovered, and then pretty quickly spreads to different parts of Northern and then the rest of Europe.
Yeah.
And, what's interesting is that this blight occurred not just in Ireland, but throughout different parts of Europe. However, it became a famine in Ireland to the degree that it didn't in other places. And that's part of the story that I think that we want to concentrate on and tell today.
Right. No, there's definitely a big story of, right. So I think broadly people think of the Irish famine as being caused by the potato blight, which it was. But they think of it as being, well, the blight happened in Ireland. It was contained in Ireland, and that's why the Irish people suffered from it. And there's a multitude of stories around why that's not the case. And two, there's a bunch of reasons for why Ireland specifically, which has to do with colonialism itself. And I also want to just highlight, when we're talking about the blight, which is sort of a nebulous term, but there are pictures of sort of what potatoes looked like during this period. And and they were kind of like, basically what they did was is create these sort of like splotchy-ish black marks on potatoes. And from what the picture showed me, and obviously I wasn't around during the time of the blight, but from what the picture shows, it almost seems like the potatoes get really mushy and sort of just lose all sort of structural, not that you would pick one up and then like it would immediately crumble, but that you could just very easily smash it in, and it was like very kind of like gooey and like just didn't have any structure to it anymore.
Yeah,
just to paint a picture.
Yeah, not only does the tuber itself show the expression of the blight, but the plant above ground does as well. So the plant above ground, of course, is green and turns brown, if not black, once it's affected with this blight. So the blight itself is a water mold, which is disseminated by spores transported in the air. And so it's very difficult to contain and spreads very quickly. And so when it first broke out, there were so many people growing potatoes because, as we described, it was such a staple crop, particularly for the poor, and many people were poor. And it became such a widespread monocrop that really was conducive to this blight spreading very quickly. But let's back up for a second and sort of set the scene a little bit. If we're talking specifically about the situation in Ireland, and one of the reasons we're doing that is not just to tell this important part of history, but also as sort of a cautionary tale for what happens when there's not a lot of genetic diversity in a food supply. But in the 1600s, the potato is introduced into Europe. It becomes a staple food, particularly for the poor, for the peasants. And then if we jump ahead into one of the reasons is because it did really well in the Irish climate, right? And so the Irish is the mild, damp climate in most places, and it fared a bit better than it did in many parts of continental Europe. It's cool, but it's generally frost-free, and so it was widely adopted. It's a cheap source of food that is easily stored, and it's also could be fed to livestock as well. So not only did it support families and individuals, but it supported the livestock that they depended on as well. Now, to get into the political situation a little bit here, starting in 1801, Ireland was ruled by Great Britain. And the political arrangement was such that many of the people living in Ireland were not landowners. And this was during the rise of, capitalism and private property, where having control over land was having power and having control. And so tenants rented land that they cultivated, very different from the sort of commons feudal system. And being able to generate a lot of food from smaller amounts of land was a really great benefit. So that's, again, another reason that contributes to the widespread adoption of the potato throughout Ireland.
And I think I think it's worth pointing out, as we're talking about sort of, Irish not owning land, sort of just highlighting, well, who did own the land? And I think, you already hinted at it, but it was English nobility, right?
Yeah, and those that supported the nobility.
Right, and those that supported nobility. And I think, we often think about colonies like colonialization as being sort of, in Africa, in North, South America, and India, and Asia, in Oceania, and XYZ. But Ireland actually has had a very brutal history of colonialization by the English, right? They suffered very similar tactics as a lot of the world did under the English nobility at the time. And this was, I think, where we're going is, this is a culmination of a lot of those policies, a lot of those colonialization policies towards the Irish, who are basically next door neighbors to England.
Right. And remember, at this time, there's no Republic of Ireland in Northern Ireland. There's one entity. Northern Ireland becomes an independent country in 1921, after the War of Independence. And there's a war with the Great Britain. There's a War of Independence, and then we have the situation we have today, which is Northern Ireland being part of the United Kingdom, and the Republic of Ireland being an independent country. But at the time that we're talking about, that hadn't happened yet. right?
Right.
So that's important to note. Um, One of the other things to note that's really important for the story is that there was really one main variety of potato that was widely adopted throughout Ireland, and that was called the lumper, the Irish lumper. It's
The
sometimes
lumper.
or that there's like a scientific name which I don't know and probably have trouble pronouncing.
We could just call it the
But
lumper. It's a great name.
that's a really important part of this story as well. And there's various statistics out there, but I mean a very large percentage of the Irish population depended on the potato for sustenance, and a lot of it had to deal with the fact that they could grow it and they couldn't afford anything else. It wasn't that there wasn't other food there, but it became a food that the very poor could sustain themselves with.
Right.
So here's
it's perfect concoction of issues, right? It's a single source monocropped food that was, almost entirely eaten by the poor, less wealthy people, on areas that would be very densely packed with sort of this crop, right? And with the disease, a blight that was being spread airborne, which was already a easy method of transportation.
That's right.
Right.
And this is a plant, the potato plant that didn't even exist a few hundred years in this part of the world, several hundred years before, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is a fairly new introduction to Europe and to Ireland in particular in this case, that became really important very quickly. So in the 60 years before the famine, so the famine starts in 1845, Ireland's population doubled from 4 million to 8 million people.
Wow. That's incredible growth.
Right.
Wow.
That's it doubled in 60 years, which was more than, growth for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years previously. And the potato is a really big part of that story.
Right. And no small part. I mean, we can't attribute all of that to the potato, but certainly I think, as we know, as a cheap staple food is able to be introduced into any population, that has a habit of growing the population, because now, there's less competition for resource. Any population, humans or otherwise, we know that happens.
Now, Ireland did not industrialize as quickly as other parts of Northern Europe, and certainly not as much as England, for example, where industrialization first started. So in 1845, apparently 7 of 8 people still lived in rural areas and were in charge of their own subsistence for the most part. Very few of them owned land. And the highest numbers and the highest densities were in the poorest lands, where the potato was the way that they could exist, right? And so this is also part of the context for understanding why this blight becomes a famine in Ireland and not necessarily other places.
Mm-hmm.
So I was reading about several theories about how the blight came to Belgium and then spread throughout Europe, but apparently it arrived from North America. It first broke out in Belgium in the summer, I guess, of 1845. And then by August or September, the first report of blight happens in Ireland. And, one of the other things we should say is that once a plant is infected by the blight, the tuber is no longer edible, right? There's nothing that you can do to process it or to cut out anything. It just basically becomes unnutritious at that point. And not only that, but it can also affect stored quantities of potatoes as well. So not just plants that are growing, but plants that had been stored. And so a reserve supply of food was also affected by that.
Well, that makes sense, right? Because as we talked about last week, the potato, if we go back to the example of my potato experiment inside my cupboard, it's really just the plant that's just going to keep growing itself. And so whether it's, stored or not, unless you're storing it in a big old bag of salt, which I imagine would probably be the only way back then to stop the blight from happening. I imagine that it's just as susceptible, right? There's no different, if you pull off an apple from a tree, those two things are fairly different from each other.
Yeah.
But a potato is a potato. A potato is
they struggled to contain this. Right?
Mm-hmm. Makes total sense. Yeah.
And so the blight in Ireland was pronounced from 1845 to about 1851. By 1852, apparently it starts to trail off and crops start to rebound and things change. But a lot happened in those 6 or 7 years. So 1845, about a third of the crop was lost. 1846, the blight reappears in the summer. 3/4 of the crop is lost. So this causes people to have to immigrate. And so the first move is to move to cities. So most places in Ireland lost significant populations. As we mentioned, most people are living in rural areas, but Cork, Dublin, and Belfast all increase in population because people are moving to the cities in hopes of finding work and in hopes of finding food and in hopes of finding subsistence. In 1846, it was also coupled with a very severe winter, and there were outbreaks of fever and dysentery epidemics. And so mortality rises sharply because, people are living together in close quarters and spreading these epidemics amongst each other. People are lacking nutrition and can't support themselves. They don't have work. And so a lot of people are dying, and then a lot of people are leaving. Right? And so that's this big story, is the story of immigration from Ireland to other places in the world. And 1847 apparently is the year in which the blight and the famine were most pronounced. The blight is severe, but the potato is a little less severe, but the potato harvest is still very poor. 2/3 of the crop is lost again in 1848. A cholera epidemic breaks out in the winter of late fall of 1848. By 1849, the potato blight starts to be contained to the west and the south, but that's where most people were living, in rural areas, and where most of the poor people were living. And again, it's not until 1852 that things start to recede. And so one of the things is that during this period of time of about 6 years, 1 million people die. Right? So the population is 8 million, and 1 million people die. And then another over 1 million people leave the country.
Right.
And the top destination, not the only destination, the top destination is North America, and the United States is the top destination. And
right.
We mentioned 200,000 of those people made their way to New York City alone. Right.
Right. Which we talked about inside our New York City episode.
That's
right. I like to, joke around, that, Ireland's biggest export today is pubs, right? You can find an Irish pub in basically any city, like almost anywhere in the world. Somewhere there's going to be an Irish pub.
And that speaks to this exodus of people who had to seek opportunity to survive and feed their families in other parts of the world.
Exactly.
So think about that, a population of 8 million people, and in 6 years, 1 million people die and over 1 million people leave. And so 3/4 of the population is gone in 6 years. And that immigration away from Ireland continues in the subsequent years. I was fascinated to find out that the population of Ireland in 1845 was higher than it is today.
Which I have heard a similar statistic. Yeah.
So
and it's interesting
not recovered in a sense from this.
Yeah. It's interesting to think not of just like, we typically think of almost in like a binary scale, right? It's like this thing happened and now 2 million people left Ireland and, all that kind of stuff. But there's so many different things that go into that, one, like, who exactly is leaving? Well, it's probably people who have a little bit more money, maybe have a little bit more status, and therefore there's a wealth drain, right? And those same people are probably more educated. And so there's probably a little bit of a brain drain going on from Ireland.
Well, and I think it also cut across to some degree. And I think some people would just, they mortgage their future in order to get on a ship and leave as well. So there's different things there. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's still, I imagine like there were people who probably just, they had no means to leave. They didn't have anything, right? Obviously there had to have been. And so it's just interesting to think about sort of who is leaving, who is able to leave, right? Already probably people who are fairly healthy were able to even make the trek, because it's still, even the 1800s was still a longish journey, right?
For sure.
It wasn't hopping on a plane and being, in New York in 5 hours or whatever the flight time is. So there's an interesting sort of undercurrent of, this is already very bad for Ireland. They're already losing a lot of people to all these, breaks out of, famine, starvation, cholera, all these, different things that are happening, cold winters, then people leaving. And it's like Ireland is left in a very bad state. And I think to your point, what you just mentioned before I went on this little tangent here was that Ireland still hasn't fully recovered in terms of population.
Right.
And that, I think that speaks volumes to the impact that this blight and this famine has had on the Irish, on Ireland at large, whether that's Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland. I think broadly just the entire island.
So I have this quote here from a book called The Irish Famine, a documentary history, Noel Kissane, 1995. And the quote is, the general problem was not that there was an absolute shortage of food, but rather that a large percentage of the population didn't have the money to buy what was available. And so there was corn available, in sacks in the big cities.
Mm-hmm.
But there wasn't the political will, particularly in the part of the British, to bring food to the people who needed it. And so you have people dependent on this food on a very narrow genetic, one variety in particular, which the blight doesn't wipe out, but really, has a huge impact, from season to season, taking out a third to 3/4 of the crop. And again, it's not that there's not any food there. It's that people can't afford the food, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's analogs to this today. I mean, we have a similar situation in the world today where there are people starving in poor countries and affluent countries, and there's food for people, but we haven't worked out the political will to deliver food to people who need it always. And so
Right.
That's why this situation is worth learning. It's worth learning about in and of itself, but it also informs the way that the world is still kind of operating today on a larger
Mm-hmm.
scale.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and you already sort of touched on this, but and we already established this, right? There was a potato blight everywhere. There was only the Irish famine. There wasn't an English famine at the same time.
There was probably, I'm sure this was pronounced and had a big impact on lives in other countries, particularly in Northern Europe, but it didn't precipitate this huge famine where 1 million people died, and you had this mass exodus of people who really had no choice but to leave. That's the story happened in Ireland.
It's an incredible story, a sad story. I hate to do this because it's actually, I feel like this is taking a little bit away from the story, but we do need to jump to an ad break because we're quite a bit over right now. So let's do that, and then we'll launch back into it. So here we go.
We'll be right back.
And we are back. I think we're sort of wrapping up our Irish part of the potato story here, as impactful as it's been. But I'll let Hunter lead us.
Yeah, I think there's more we could say about it, but this is a story of the potato and how it transformed the fortunes of people throughout the world, and the sort of rise and fall of the potato in Ireland, and how it brought doubled population in a short period of time. But then also, when that crop was threatened, had a huge impact on the fortunes of the people and in the country that's still being experienced today, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's one other thing. I want to start to jump ahead to some of the more contemporary discussions about what's happening with the potato. But another thing that I found in the research, which was interested, is that, and I mentioned that the potato, particularly in Northern Europe, needed a little help at times.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the time that people are starting to recognize the role that additional fertilizers can play, particularly, fixing nitrogen into the soil to make sure that plants can grow in cases where it doesn't happen. And that there was a series of islands off the southern coast of Peru called the Chincha Islands, that were layered and layered with guano, which is the dried remains of bird excrement. And that turned out to be a fantastic fertilizer, and particularly apparently had the nitrogen that was needed. And so an industry started in this where, and apparently there were layers and layers, over 100 feet deep of this,
Oh my God.
of this excrement, which was, apparently a pretty horrific kind of environment to be exposed to.
Yeah,
And
I can imagine.
again, in gruesome fashion, a lot of this guano was harvested by slaves, many from China, and then sold into Europe. So this is another aspect of the nefarious sort of rise of global colonialism and the economies that supported it. The U.S., in fact, apparently started to claim islands that had guano. It was so important that there was something called the Guano Islands Act of 1856 passed in the United States, where it simply appropriate territory if they thought that they could take this resource and trade it on the market. And the reason that this particular story is highlighted in the literature is because it's an illustration to the degree to which agriculture, particularly in the United States and Europe, which had become industrialized, became dependent on these additional inputs, where you bring things from another part of the world and bring them to the soil, and that's necessary for producing the giant monocrops that were the hallmark of industrial agriculture. And so, this is sometimes cited, this aspect of the trade related to the potato in part is also sort of credited, I guess you could say, with putting in motion the industrial agriculture that we experience today, in which massive inputs of fertilizers, pesticides, insecticides are needed to grow the kind of monocrops that we have today. And of course, those aren't coming from these islands anymore. There was a process in the 1940s, which we may have referenced during the plastics episode, where oil was transformed into fertilizer through a process called petrochemicalization. And so today, a lot of, and this isn't everywhere in the world, but in a lot of very productive places in the United States in particular, a lot of the inputs of fertilizer and insecticides, pesticides are coming from petroleum-derived products. So the potato, it's not totally the story there, but it's one of the other ways that potato sort of helps set the template for what becomes the way that industrial agriculture functions today.
Which is not, well, I guess it is surprising. So I didn't know guano. I knew what guano was broadly, just sort of excrement of birds and I think bats as well. I've known about that. I did not know that it was a fertilizer,
a globally traded commodity,
and nor did I know that it was globally traded. Nor did I now I have this horrific image in my head of 100 feet deep of, well, guano.
Right, and people being forced to work in this environment, which I'm sure life expectancy.
I can only imagine the horrors of it. Like it does not sound like a pleasant experience. It seems pretty,
just brutal, absolutely horrific,
very brutal, right? Yeah, absolutely.
So, since we're starting to talk about industrialized agriculture, let's bring the story to the present and talk a little bit about where potatoes are produced today. And we can talk about that globally, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about how that plays out in the United States as well. One of the other sources that I found that was very interesting for information is called Potato Pro, which is an online information provider of the global potato industry. So this is a organization that exists to provide data, particularly for producers of potatoes. And then there's also something called the National Potato Council of the United States, which is a storehouse of data about how potatoes are processed and where and what they're used for in the United States. So a lot of the data that we'll discuss in this next section comes from some of those sources.
Yeah, and that's got to be a lobbying group as well, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Right, I imagine, yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And as one of the largest crops in the world, there's a lot of power behind supporting the industries and promoting those industries as well.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that the that Potato Pro pulls is data from the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is part of the United Nations. And the most updated information I could find was production of potatoes in 2019. And this doesn't include sweet potatoes because they're not potatoes.
I will go to my grave saying that.
Yeah. Now, so we know that the Andes, South America, is where the potato is originally from, and that they moved to Europe and they spread. And we gave some illustrations in the last episode. You gave you a rough idea of when they arrive in different areas. Jeff, do you want to guess where there are more potatoes produced than anywhere else? In what country do you think that is today?
Well, I can guess, but I also have your notes in front of me, so I'm going to put myself in the seat of somebody who's just maybe casually listening, and I would say that, if I was just a normal sort of United States person, I would probably say the United States. Just knowing what I know about how much agriculture there is inside this country, and that's it's basically Idaho is potato country, and Idaho is actually a pretty big state. So but I know that's going to be a different answer.
But you know that it's not correct. But you also know, because you have this statistics in front of you, that the United States is number 5 on the list. So it's not a bad guess, right? Because I'm more than anywhere else in the world outside of 4 different countries.
I'm looking at number 1 though, and it's higher. It's quite a bit higher.
Number 1 is China, and it's not by a little bit, right? So the production, number 2 on the list is India. And so this is interesting because China and India have the most population, number 1 and number 2. Mm-hmm. I think we've said before, and I think many people know that India is projected very soon to become the most populated country in the world.
I think by some projections it is today. I think there are differing projections.
Depending on the estimates, because they're not counting people, they're going on, modeling. Right. And that might already be the case. Mm-hmm. But China produces over twice the amount of potatoes that India does.
Which is amazing. And I know potatoes have gotten into a lot of different dishes. I can't think of a specific Chinese dish that I know off the top of my head that factors in potatoes so heavily like I can with, basically a lot of other sort of dishes from a lot of other countries.
Yeah, I mean, the cuisine that we're exposed to from China is probably very limited.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point.
And there's a lot of regional variations going on. Mm-hmm. How much of this is for export from China, I also don't know. So I imagine that there's a lot of domestic consumption, but a lot of this is probably for export as well. Mm-hmm. Number 3 on the list is the Russian Federation.
Vodka.
And the potato, I think, is a pretty big staple there as well. Mm-hmm. India, not double Russia, but close to double Russian production. Number 4 on the list, Ukraine. And number 5, United States. And then number 6 is Germany. And the United States is almost double of Germany. So, once we get down the list, there's sort of less and less production. Mm-hmm. Bangladesh, number 7. It's interesting because Bangladesh is a very poor country. And so the story of this food, again, I don't know what's for export, and I don't know what the economy, how that factors into it. But it might be that in a country that's very poor, the potatoes once again found a very important role as a staple crop. And then we'll round out the top 10 here, maybe Poland, Netherlands, and France. And then we go Belarus, United Kingdom. So, European countries are still involved in growing lots of potatoes, as they have been since the late 1500s, early 1600s.
I'm kind of interested in and kind of surprised at the lack of African countries here. I see Algeria, I see Egypt. Those are obviously very northern African. Yep. I would have expected, and we talked a little bit about Kenya earlier, getting the potato in mid 1800s, sometime around there. I would have expected to see more agriculture. Just knowing the potato, all that we've learned so far, I would have expected to see more potato. I mean, my speculation is maybe it doesn't adapt well to environments there. Yeah, it could be. Again, the cassava root, which is also from South America, is much more of an important tuber in sub-Saharan Africa. And you have sorghum and other crops that are a little less common in North America
that are really important crops. But root and tuber crops are very important in Africa. So it is an interesting thing. The other thing that I'm seeing on this list, which I think is curious, is that Peru is number 15 on the list. So, you might guess that the origin of the country where this food originated might have a higher place on the list, and it's 15. It's not an insignificant spot to be 15th in world production of potatoes.
Not insignificant, and also probably not counting the wild potatoes that are also right, because I think we established.
So the wild potatoes, though, a lot of them are not edible. But to sort of to since we're talking about it, one of the things that we might circle back to when we conclude is that the Centro Internacional de la Papa, the International Potato Center, is doing research, though, with wild potatoes to see if there are resiliencies to, changes in temperature and water regimes, through climate change or various things that can be brought into domesticated potatoes as a way of ensuring that food security. So the wild potatoes, although in themselves, many of them apparently not suitable for human consumption. And part of it, I think it's, I don't know, in some cases it might be toxic. In some cases it might not be palatable, but that there is research being done to try to harness the benefits of wild potatoes for domesticated.
Right. I think broadly, and I would be surprised if most industries are trying to do something similar, but they as we already discussed with Ireland and the potato blight, obviously that's very detrimental to the crop as well as food to a lot of people. And we saw something similar happen with the banana, right?
Right.
The banana that we eat today up until about the middle of the 1900s is not the banana that people used to eat. There's actually a different variety, but that variety basically went extinct because of a similar sort of blight situation. And what ended up replacing it was a type of banana that was immune or at least resilient towards that blight. And so I imagine, there's probably a lot of research and sort of effort that go into, okay, if another sort of blight happens that's potentially going to wipe out our current crops of potatoes, how can we ensure that there's some sort of redundancy in the system to ensure that, these potatoes, might be similar and, still have the same effect and people still want them, but just be resistant. Because I know that's a worry. I know that's a worry now with the current banana industry, with another sort of blight hitting the kind of bananas we like today.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that banana is not going to be around for much longer. And again, you choose one variety of a plant, of a crop to consume and monocrop that, and that may not pan out that well over the long term. Some information I have here suggests that a third of all the potatoes in the world are harvested in China and India, and that China, which, as we mentioned, is the world's largest consumer of potatoes. So according to this, consumer of potatoes, not just producer, expects that fully 50% of the increased food production it will need to meet demand in the next 20 years will come from potatoes. So that there's an enormous amount of promise, hope, dependence in China alone in the future for the potato as well. Until the early 1990s, most potatoes were grown and consumed in North America, Europe, and the countries of the former Soviet Union. And of course, we've seen that's already shifted quite dramatically because we've talked about China and India. Since then, there's been since the early 1990s, a dramatic increase in potato production demand in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where output has increased by more than 5 times since the 1960s through 2007. And then the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations shows they suggest that in 2005, for the first time, the developing or the poorest part of the world, potato production exceeded that of the more affluent parts of the world. So that just underscores what an important part of food security the potato is for people really in almost every part of the world.
Right. No, I mean, everything we've been building up to is just highlighting just how important the potato is. The humble, very humble potato is to so many different people around the world, including, me very closely, reliant on the potato. I wouldn't say reliant, but I just love it so much.
It's been part of my diet as long as I remember.
I rely on it for my social well-being, my
right.
for my soul.
Do we need an ad?
I think so. I think it's about time for second ad time, and then I think we're gonna start launching into maybe a little bit more Idaho-y territory.
Yeah, we'll start talking we'll hone in on the United States a little bit, since that's where this podcast is based.
Sounds great. Let's jump to a quick ad break then. Here we go. And we are back to we're gonna talk, I think, about the US and sort of what the potato means to us.
Well, so there are many states that produce potatoes in the United States. And I won't even, quiz you on what the top one is, because we've already talked about Idaho.
Gotta be Idaho.
But there's another state that doesn't produce quite as much as Idaho, but produces over 4 times as much as any other state outside of Idaho. And that's Washington State.
Oh, really? I was going to guess Oregon. And I can tell you why I was going to guess Oregon.
Okay.
Because there's that brand, Ore-Ida,
That's
which
right.
is Oreida. And I learned, I don't know how long ago, the fun little fact was that stands for Oregon, Idaho potatoes. And I just assumed, well, hey, that's probably why, because Oregon also grows a lot of potatoes. I didn't realize maybe they should have called it Wash-Ida.
Well, Washington is... So what I'm looking at here, these are statistics from, I think, 2020, provided by the United States, the National Potato Council, which is located in the United States. It's not a government thing. Idaho produces 12.89 billion pounds of potatoes a year, apparently.
Wow.
It's hard to know what that is, but it seems like a lot.
I mean,
so that's almost 13. In the case of Washington, it's 9.33 billion pounds. Then with number 3 state is Wisconsin, which is 2.91 billion pounds. So it drops by a third from Washington.
Quite the drop, yeah.
And then number 4 at 2.64 billion pounds is Oregon.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's on the list.
Still, again, I would have expected number 2. Still pretty heavily, reduced from Idaho and Washington.
Since we're doing top 10s right now, let's just round it out here. After that, we go to North Dakota, Colorado, Michigan, Maine, Minnesota, and then California. So it's interesting that California, which is by far the state that produces the most agriculture overall, they're growing other things there. They're growing, over 1 billion pounds.
Still a lot, yeah.
That's a lot.
It's got to be just because California being such a fertile area, there are things that require much more, I guess I'll just say crops that are pickier about their environment.
Or need more sun, perhaps.
Need more sun, more, whatever. That are also probably more profitable to grow.
That would be my guess as well.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how potatoes are utilized in the United States. In other words, in what form is the potato? 40%. 40% are frozen, and that's, I think, largely French fries. Right?
Probably. It's got to be. Well, there are other frozen aspects of potatoes, but still so many. You can buy so many, or you can go to the store and see so many bags of frozen French fries.
It's incredible. So 25% fresh. So that's not a lot. It's a lot, but it's not as much as 40% frozen. So in other words, there are more potatoes that are probably turned into fries than make their way on somebody's table in the form of a baked potato or something like that.
Which, again, that might be not good for our collective waistbands, but...
Well, so 25% fresh, and these are statistics, again, from 2020. These probably fluctuate from year to year. 23% of potatoes are turned into potato chips.
Oh, that makes so much sense. That sounds so good right now, too.
That's a lot of potato chips. 7% dehydrated, 3% refrigerated, and then 2% other. And so I don't know, potato starch, there's all kinds of different things. And then there's seed, and seed is a misnomer really, because when you take part of a tuber, it's not really a seed because it's not growing something; it's growing a clone of the original plant. So you know we talked about culturally speaking how important the potato is, and certainly the French fry, which is Belgian, as we already talked about. I don't know if that was this episode or the last one. The United States is kind of really well known for the French fry, which is probably not the healthiest way to consume a potato. But I think, the United States has that reputation as being a place where people are eating fries all the time.
Right. Well, and what I was going to say is it's sort of, I'm noticing a trend here, and I'm sure this applies to a lot of different areas, right? Like, for example, I know potato chips, or they call them potato crisps in the UK, are very popular. Yep. But what I'm noticing is that, we sort of established early on that the potato is a very not only durable and cheap source of food, but also a very nutritious one. And what I'm noticing is that in the US, how much of it has been converted into what we would classify as junk food.
Right. Made less nutritious than it should be.
Made less nutritious, made more, I would argue tastier.
Well, you add a lot of salt and, hydrated fat to something, and it's going to taste really good, but it's, again, not necessarily, and then everything in moderation, but, as a staple, it wouldn't be particularly good to live on.
Right. As much as I would love for potato chips to be a staple of mine, I can't do that.
We can't advise that on this podcast.
Yeah, that is not advisable, but it's just interesting culturally. Again, I don't know exactly how every country has done it, but it does feel like the US has gravitated towards seeing the potato as less of a staple nutrition and more of a junk food sort of extra, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I mean, it's become, in the United States with industrialized agriculture, increasingly move away from food as thinking of it as a whole food and thinking of it as a commodity, a publicly, a commodity that can be traded on stock markets and things like that. I have some statistics from 2016, which is the most recent I could find for this particular category, but this is the most popular variety of potato grown in the United States. You want to take a guess?
I would hope that it's the red potato because that's my favorite kind of potato, but I don't think that's probably true.
It's not the red potato.
It's probably whatever the sort of those big knobbly brown ones are.
Yeah, so those are,
I don't know what they're called though.
There are various varieties of russet potatoes. Okay. And the russet Burbank accounts for 41% of potato production in the United States.
That's probably the one that, like, as I'm picturing a baked potato. That's probably what that is, right?
It's also the one that can make a nice long French fry, probably.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, because they are pretty big, right?
If you think about the number one utilization of potatoes in the United States is French fries, that you would need a potato that would be conducive to that. And the small red potatoes are not really French fry potatoes. In fact, the top 4 varieties of potatoes grown in the United States in 2016 were all varieties of russet potatoes, which together accounted for 69% of all potatoes grown. So again, if we look back at the Irish potato famine, and one of the big issues there was not a lot of diversity of variety, which, had a big impact when the blight came. And, it's maybe a risky scheme to just monocrop, although there's a big demand for it. There's the Colorado potato beetle, which apparently is not from Colorado, but because I don't want to malign the state of Colorado for this beetle, which apparently doesn't come from there. But that is one of the contemporary biggest threats to potatoes, and growing potatoes in large monocrop type situations is very difficult to do because of this particular pest. So that's something that we should at least mention, I think, as well.
Yeah, and for people who aren't caught up on their U.S. geography, Colorado is not that far away from Idaho, where we grow most of our potatoes.
And Colorado is also a major. It's number 6 on the list of high producing potato states. So again, I think we're about to wrap things up here a little bit, but I mean, over this episode and the last one, we really have talked about how this globalized food, which had thousands of years developing lots of different varieties in one part of the world, within a couple hundred years became a major staple for many other parts of the world, and one in which many countries are going to be hoping will continue to be an increasingly important part of diets, and that has had political and economic and cultural aspects to it, and we've touched on some of those different things. And I just wanted to circle back to this idea that, the International Potato Center is working with indigenous people in the Andes to continue to preserve the diversity of potatoes, but also to try to find ways in which the wild potatoes and the benefits from them in terms of resilience to pests, to drought, to water scarcity, these kinds of things, may also improve the domesticated varieties that are used to provide for human consumption and this really important human staple. I mean, there's only wheat and rice, I think, are growing greater quantities. I've seen actually a couple different statistics that suggest corn is more than potatoes or potatoes more than corn. So I'm not sure which is correct, but those are the top four in terms of food staple crops that are produced throughout the world.
Well, and we've seen what has happened with wheat, given recent geopolitical events inside the world, the war in Ukraine, and it's scary, as we list out, especially as far as certainly as China and India are concerned, how much they grow, how much of the world, and how much they're expecting to rely on the potato. If potato blight 2.0 comes roaring through, that's a scary proposition. We know that agricultural markets can't just rebound and sort of flip on a dime, that things take a lot of time to readjust. And what does that mean if that happens again? And that's a scary thought, right? Because if
our major way of fighting issues related to growing potatoes is through petroleum, then that's a very fossil fuel dependent way of approaching solutions to our food supply. So that's another element of this that could become critical, increasingly critical, as we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it kind of feels like we're leaving this on a sad note. So I'll just go ahead and say that I love the potato. It's gone on an incredible journey throughout the world. I think it's literally gone around the world twice now. And I don't know, where we would be without it, to be honest.
I also hope it answers the question to our new setup, which is, geography is everything. And if we say geography is the potato, hopefully after listening to these two podcasts, we've at least also convinced some people that there is a very geographical way of looking at particular things. And the potato, although might seem more suited to a biology or agricultural podcast, which would be a very interesting topic, is very well suited to talking about, is very well suited to a geographical lens and a spatial lens. So this is a good way to kick off our newly rebranded title to our podcast.
I agree. Perfect. Yeah. And so, Hunter, I know you're probably dying to get to your dinner, which does consist of some French fries, some fried potatoes. So let's have you kick us off with our pluggables here.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm Hunter Shobe. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm co-author of Portland is a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left Cities, a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, co-authored with David Banas.
Yeah, and my name is, once again, Jeff Gibson. You can find me on YouTube. That's youtube.com/geography by Jeff. And then, of course, you can find Hunter and I, as well as this podcast, if you're not already listening to it there, on Substack. And we encourage you to subscribe and follow us there. It's geographyiseverything.substack.com. We're looking to hopefully build a really cool community of geography nerds just like us. So we are, I think next week, we are going to turn our attention to the sky a little bit. We're going to talk about some skyscrapers and sort of why, really the geography is skyscrapers, and really talk about cities and sort of how the skyscraper has fundamentally altered. Well, just to give you a hint about some of the initial research I've been doing, it's been pretty impactful to the world at large. So with that, we will see you next time.
Thanks for joining, everybody.